So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, my name is Handrij Hartel, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our today's lecture. As you probably know, this lecture is held within the framework of the project with the title Trends in Nature Conservation. This is a project funded by Norway grants and implemented by the Charles University Faculty of Science in Prague, in the form of lectures held by both national and international experts. Before I will welcome our distinguished guest, I would like to give you some technical advice regarding organization of this lecture. So please note, this lecture will be recorded and later uploaded on the YouTube channel of this project. If you have any question or comments, you can use the chat during the presentation, and we will go through this question after the presentation. And you can find the chat icon on the bottom toolbar. Or you can raise question directly after the presentation. In this case, please indicate your interest by raising hand. This is the icon raise hand on the bottom toolbar. So now allow me to welcome our guest from Hungary. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Zoltan Kun to you, who will talk today about the EU policies influencing the protection of old-growth forests. Zoltan Kun is the head of conservation in the organization called Wild Europe and has over 25 years of experience in working with protected areas, landscape planning, and forestry. And he is especially focused on protection of primary and old-growth forests in Europe. So I am sure, Zoltan, you will definitely explain closer this context in your lecture. So, Zoltan, welcome again in our education program, and I am pleased to give you the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to speak to this collection of Czech organizations. I guess most of the people here are Czech or from Czech Republic, and I hope you hear me. I share my screen. I prepared the presentation. The presentation outline, basically, I will try to first introduce myself a little bit, although Handrij has already said a few words about me, which I appreciate very much. I will also introduce the organization that I represent here today. Then I will talk about the EU policies with link to the CPD COP15 discussion, which could be even more relevant for Czech Republic because the Montreal conference was under the Czech presidency. And I attended the conference in Montreal, and I met several representatives of the Czech presidency. I know they have done a really great and very tireless job in Montreal for over 2 weeks to get the best out of the COP15 as possible. Then I will introduce one short, in one slide, the IUCN resolution that deals with old-growth forests. I will also try to present a few examples and lessons learned, talk about funding. And I also wanted to get a slide, I think it's only one slide, maybe two, about concrete actions, proposals for Czech Republic itself, for your country, and then close my presentation with the Q&A session. So Wild Europe itself started as a cooperative initiative more than a decade ago amongst dozens of organizations and teams from, I don't know, BirdLife or WWF to even the European Commission had a representative in the initiative. The focus of Wild Europe is on wilderness rewilding or restoring wilderness attributes in Europe, forests and wetlands in habitat types especially. The organization or the initiative was turned into a foundation actually last year in 2022. And personally, I'm a forestry technician, which I guess some people here, even in the audience, knows this is like how to cut trees, how to use a chainsaw, how to remove timber from a forest. Then I studied landscape architecture in university. I'm a WCPA member, World Commission on Protected Area, and the Commission on Ecosystem Management member. These are commissions of IUCN. And I'm one of the original funders of the European Wilderness Society, but I'm not involved any longer in that organization. Wild Europe has organized the conference in Bratislava about old-growth forest, and the aim of that conference was to develop a protection strategy for old-growth forest. This was in 2019, just before actually the COVID outbreak. I think it was in early December, and then the COVID came sometimes in February, March 2020. It was based on a preparatory consultation. We consulted, again, dozens of organizations in advance of the conference, and we also consulted them even after the conference. We got almost 150 registrations, participants from 28 countries all across Europe, and I think we got a few people from the US. We got representatives of the European Commission, UNESCO, Council of Europe, IUCN, and various governments. There was a multi-sector representation from forestry sector to tourist sector as well. Obviously, that indicates that we had a range of various specialists at this conference. And then they all provided an input to this strategy, which is available on the website of our organization. And I must say that most of the elements that was developed in this strategy actually got into the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. So we developed or included a definition structure for old-growth forest. And I'd like to stop here a little bit. The reason why we call it as a definition structure, because defining old-growth forest or old-growthness of forest was really difficult to get one single definition for all European countries. So rather than have something that is carved into the stone and applies to every single country, we developed a document which outlined what elements should be included in old-growth forest definition on a regional or biogeographical regional scale, or maybe on a national scale. So because we didn't want to get into trouble and of the various language interpretation, we actually, by purpose, came up with a structure rather than a concrete word-by-word definition. Then another element of this is a mapping of old-growth forest and primary forest, and that included the early warning system at the EWS framework, which actually led to project proposal development. We are not running yet this proposal, but it looks as we are going to get hopefully funding for this year. Then there are practical protection initiatives listed in this document, policy and law gaps, funding and incentive, and I'm going to talk about funding opportunities and potentially incentives for financing the protection of old-growth forest, even in private with private land ownership. And then the last element is a communication and representation. Representation here means contact or letters towards organizations that are relevant for policy development. So in the old-growth forest definition structure, we, again, it's not EU, it's Europe-wide definition. So though the organization largely focuses on EU, but we have also connections through the Bern Convention to non-EU countries. And actually, we worked in cooperation with Frankfurt Zoological Society. At that time, I was actually employed by FZS. We worked on a mapping project in the framework of a larger research project, global research project that looked into the impact of primary forest in the boreal and the temperate zone. This was coordinated by Griffiths University from Australia. In the framework, we were in charge of the European part, the European field project element. And we actually helped Francesco Sabatini and his team to update the earlier mapping exercise for old-growth forest. Francesco published I think his first research in 2018. Unfortunately, this research had some gaps in terms of geographical coverage. What we managed to get into this project through Griffiths is to actually cover the totality of Europe. And finally, the data set for the old-growth forest was published in 2021. Successfully, fortunately, I would say, it was again published at the right time because the EU Joint Research Centre actually used this information as one of the main data source for their old-growth forest publication that was coming out last year in 2022. The two linkage here, the URLs indicate where you can access the action plan and the practical guideline definition. This, as Handrij said, a presentation is recorded, and my presentation is also provided to the organizers as a PDF, so you should be able to actually get this information from the website after my presentation. So then, after all this, I mean, I will talk about the EU policy very soon, but I think we should not forget that the Kunming-Montreal document that was just approved in Montreal now as an outcome of the Conference of Parties, the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties of the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, it echoes quite a lot and resonates EU policy. So I thought that first we should cover this a little bit in the presentation. You know that the CBD had the Aichi targets, or you probably know these were adopted in 2010, and one of the Aichi targets was about the protected area coverage on terrestrial areas. I'm talking about terrestrial areas because I'm in Hungary. I'm from Hungary, which is a landlocked country. Czech Republic is also a landlocked country. So I thought that this is the most relevant. We committed that 17% of the land area or terrestrial area should be protected by 2020. Interestingly, if you check out the European Environmental Agency website, there is a dashboard about the biodiversity strategy. You can see that Europe, the EU, has already accomplished the Aichi target. In Europe, we already have 26% of the areas protected, of the terrestrial areas. Whether that's good quality protection or not, I don't want to get into this discussion now, maybe in the Q&A session, but I think we certainly have to deal with not only with the quantity, but also the quality of protected areas. Anyway, moving on from the 17%, the CBD COP15 now in Montreal, that provides the new global biodiversity framework, which we call the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It largely echoes the EU policies. I've just put a few bullet points here of the targets, the most relevant targets. 30 by 30, that means that 30% of the terrestrial as well as the marine areas should be protected by 2030. Again, this is a quantitative target. Though, if I recall it correctly, the word effectiveness is also included in the document, but how we are measuring the effectiveness, that's not really defined. Restoration of at least 30% of the degraded land or ecosystem, that's also, again, we will talk about that, but very relevant for Europe. Natural ecosystems are included in the document, and I should say that when I attended the conference in Montreal, I was attending on behalf of a group of NGO that actually lobbied that the inclusion of primary ecosystem or the definition of primary ecosystem in the final document. This was not, we didn't succeed, but I mean, we feel a bit happier with the natural ecosystem. Then the payment for ecosystem services came in, which again is relevant for my presentation later on when I'm going to talk about funding. And it's very much linked to nature-based solutions. And the CBD document also talks about decreasing the per subsidies by, I think, if I recall it correctly, $500 billion US. At the last point, I just wanted to mention, I felt unfortunate that during the COP15, the parties couldn't agree on linking biodiversity and the climate crisis together. They were talking about the document to approve, but in the last minute, there were some discussions which, if I understood correctly, was linked to the financing part, who is giving money to whom, and can the developed nations pay for the undeveloped nations or less developed nations. Anyway, this discussion on funding at the end led to a kind of disagreement on the document. So later on, this document might be approved, but first the SABSTA, the scientific committee, should deal with that document. But that's a bit of a disappointment anyway, because we were really hoping that there will be formal recognition of that the two crises are linked together. So in terms of the EU policies, and that's the core of my presentation, the CBD post-2020 biodiversity framework had a so-called zero draft. And this zero draft was actually published back in 2020, I think in March. So more than 2 years now. And it included 30% protection for both terrestrial and marine areas. And it also included a wording for 10% strict protection. So I think that zero draft, which again, finally the strict protection didn't get into the COP15 final document, but in a way, the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 adopted that 10% strict protection as an ambitious target. And I think this is really groundbreaking for Europe. Personally, I like it. I know that not everyone might like that 10% strict protection idea. Again, it's to be discussed at the Q&A session, but my personal view that I really like that element of our biodiversity strategy. So again, the EU Biodiversity Strategy talks about 30% protection of terrestrial areas, 10% strict protection, which in our view, the default value of strict protection is non-intervention wilderness. And it calls for a binding restoration law and targets, which obliges, this law hasn't been approved yet, but they plan that every country will have to come up with a national restoration plan. And it also argues for 25% free-flowing river restored. And again, the element why I highlighted this free-flowing river, because I'm also involved in the Federation of Large Lakes and Wetlands here in Hungary. And I think this is also very important, because in a way we are able to have link the sea protection target to river restoration through the free-flowing target. And most importantly, and most relevant for this presentation, this biodiversity strategy calls for all remaining primary and old-growth forests, the protection of all of these in the EU urgently. What this actually means, the biodiversity strategy says all old-growth forest, OGF, requires protection. The strict protection means non-intervention, basically. So it's not that, okay, we strictly protect on paper, but it should actually mean non-intervention. At least that's under discussion within the Forest and Natura 2000 working group of the European Commission. It also calls for improved forest monitoring, because we need to increase our knowledge, obviously, on forest and what's the status of forest, how the climate change will impact these old-growth forests. And the EU Nature Restoration Law, I listed again here because it can help if we manage to actually push back a little bit the Nordic countries lobby, because some of the Nordic countries are actually lobbying for exclusion of forest habitat from the restoration law. So if we manage to push this back, then the restoration law can help to get the old-growth forest attributes to increase from the current 2-3% to, let's say, 15%. So actually we can make all the 10% protection target, tree protection target, we can turn it into 15% old-growth forest protection target through the restoration element. Again, what to do during the Swedish presidency? That's a big question, because I mean the Czech presidency has just ended and Sweden has slightly different view on forest issues. The Swedish parliament, for instance, approved a resolution that clearly says forest is a competence only of member states. Again, I disagree with this, and I say I think I legitimately disagree with this. I think forest as a habitat type has a mixed competence between member states and the European Union because of the environmental legislation, the Habitat and Bird Directive, and potentially other directives like the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. But again, Sweden, the Swedish presidency has clearly a different view. So the coming 5-6 months is going to be quite challenging for the discussions on the nature restoration law. Again, continue the EU policy context. The EU also set up a relatively ambitious target beyond the biodiversity strategy with other legislative tools like the EU Green Deal. So the EU says that it is going to provide financial and technical support or assistance to have those that are most affected by the move towards a green economy in Europe. This is called the Just Transition Mechanism, and it will mobilize a huge sum of money, at least it sounds huge, 100 billion over the period, over the next financial period. And the EU also aimed to have a climate neutrality by 2050, which again is important because this could be an argument, an additional argument why we need to protect the old-growth forests that are big reserves of carbon stock. So old-growth forests are not only important for biodiversity perspective, but also from the climate protection, climate mitigation perspective because of the carbon that is stored there. I think I will mention later on in one of my presentation, but in case I forgot to include it in my presentation, sorry to be uncertain, but we are within the Griffiths project, we actually worked quite strongly together with the University of Life Sciences of Prague, with the department led by Miro Svoboda and some other researchers like Martin Mikuláš. So I think we are just about to publish a result very soon about the carbon modeling of this old-growth forest in Europe. Finally, beyond the biodiversity strategy, obviously there is the forest strategy, which is again under huge discussion currently within the EU, partially because the forestry industry, forest owners have different view than the EU or the civil conservation NGOs, so to say. This forest strategy aims to set up a monitoring law, which again, I personally think it's really needed because we have, how to call it, really uncertain information about how forests are doing in Europe. I mean, every country is doing its national forestry inventories, but these are not really harmonized. The only message that I can bring here is coming from the EEA, the European Environmental Agency report called State of Nature in the EU, that clearly said that within the Natura 2000 network, only 14% of the forest habitats are in favor of conservation status. That single 14% indicates actually that our forests are troublesome. They are really in a trouble. The EU forest degradation law was approved. This is basically replacing the EU timber regulation, and that includes degradation also in the EU, though that's under discussion again, because some of the Nordic member states are not really happy that forest degradation is included here. Then the nature laws obviously are really important. Habitat Directive, or the Birds Directive, they are actually saying that, and interestingly, within the Forest and Natura 2000 working group, the Forest and Natura 2000 technical report is actually updated currently. I will advise you to visit the Commission website. This document, the updated document, should be published, I hope, middle of this year. because that will include some case studies, and it will also explain when the appropriate assessment is needed before forestry management. And the forest strategy also set up a new forest governance system, which is called Forest and Forestry Stakeholder Group. And the Commission has just published a call for applications for experts in this new governance system. And there are some other interesting laws that might be helpful in order to protect old-growth forests stronger. For instance, the Carpathian Convention, though this is a framework convention, but some of the protocols could be, enforced, and there is a protocol dealing with sustainable forest management, which has some language that could help to improve naturalness of forest. And the Carpathian Convention is relevant to Czech Republic because you are a signatory. So the IUCN World Conservation Congress in 2021 was delayed with a year. There, IUCN members adopted the resolution. The number is 127. This was based largely on Divide Europe 2018 protection strategy. And that resolution, which is entitled Strengthening the Protection of Primary and Old-Growth Forests in Europe and Facilitating their Restoration Where Possible, is a groundbreaking document because it helps IUCN members to actually use, again, an additional argument for the protection and the restoration of old-growth forest. This document calls for closing the gaps in the mapping of old-growth forest, also setting strict protection as a default management, prohibiting timber sourcing from old-growth forest, and protection and restoration. The document is actually available on the IUCN portal if you go for it, Resolution 127. There are still policies and negotiations to be influenced. I listed it here because Czech organizations might be able to contribute somehow to, let's say, move the EU policymaking into the right direction. For instance, the EU Forest Strategy is still under discussion. The implementation of the EU Biodiversity Strategy, including the definition of old-growth and primary forest and tree protection, these are still under discussion in the framework of the Forest and Natura 2000 working group. And I know that there are Czech members there too, because I know that member states, or every member state, are represented there. The Renewable Energy Directive and the LULUCF Directive are still being determined. And I highlighted it here because I also work for the Forest Defenders Alliance, where we are pushing for a new legislation that would not allow counting primary woody biomass towards the renewable energy target of the EU. That's because we think, or science actually proved that in the remaining 28 years, primary woody biomass, if you source it from forest, is not going to renew. So that's basically the argument that we use. And again, we can still influence the nature restoration law. Every member state will have a say on it. And I put that next to strategy because it's important that we are actually linking their ecosystem restoration and the integrity of ecosystem to climate change. And obviously the outcomes of the COP27 and the COP15 to do two different UN convention has to still be adopted by the countries. Let me check. I tried to speed up because I would like to last some time for questions. What are the negotiation opportunities? Again, Divide Europe is included, Divide Europe Foundation is included in the EU working group on this forest and Natura 2000 working group. Then what could be most relevant for you is the new Forest and Forestry Stakeholder Group call by the Commission. So Czech members, if you are active, not only in Czech Republic, but maybe outside as well, you have a legitimate opportunity to apply. And there are some active cooperation with large NGO networks like the Forest Movement Europe, coordinated by FERN, the Environmental Paper Networks, or the Forest Defenders Alliance. And any Czech IUCN member could contribute to the implementation of the mentioned IUCN resolution. What are the examples that I wanted to present here? I mean, I know that protecting old-growth forests is really difficult because in a way, foresters usually consider these as unmanaged areas that are kind of waste. So because we are not taking the timber out from these areas. But and so we need to provide some incentives to protect them, not only in state land, but maybe also in private land. So Belgium, for instance, through its prioritized action framework, suggested to establish 10,000 hectare wilderness areas with a compensation mechanism for landowners. Or Austria considers the protection as a priority to reduce risk of natural disturbances. So what I just would like to present here is there are different tools, ways, arguments for member states that could be used to enforce the protection of old-growth forest. Again, what it could be relevant for Czech Republic, I actually don't know, but yeah, these examples could provide you an interesting example. Hungary usually is not coming up as a good example nowadays within the EU. Unfortunately, that's also a justified comment, but the Hungarian Constitutional Court in 2021 published a decision that basically they banned clear cutting in Natura 2000 sites, forest Natura 2000 areas, because they said that clear cutting is causing an irreversible damage on the ecosystem. So I think these kind of tools, financial, law, or legal tools could be used or combined in the various countries. In Romania, I just wanted to present this. This is an interesting initiative from the Fundația Conservation Carpathia. Basically, they would like to develop a private national park in the Carpathian Mountain. They already mobilized, not 5, but 8 million euro from private sources to actually purchase land and allocate it for protection. And they also do actually some restoration work in the areas. And they have, during our conference in Bratislava in 2019, they presented an interesting concept called Klima Carpathia, which would aim to actually protect, and I hope you all see half of the Carpathian Mountains, basically, with the argument that it could bring benefit to the local people if this is combined with combining with the payment for ecosystem services. What are the lessons learned or issues to avoid? The ERDF, the Rural Development Fund, it's used quite often, unfortunately, to increase fragmentation of forests, and that's not good. So these should be avoided. Or the use of forest biomass as a renewable energy source increase the pressure on our forest. And we have to recognize that over half of all the timber harvested in Europe is burned, actually, providing 60% of the total renewable energy source currently. And the tendencies show an increase since the Renewable Energy Directive was coming into power. So we say that one of the recommendations is to stop subsidizing the burning of forest biomass. Funding needs. Obviously, we need funding, but why we need funding for non-intervention management? If we talk about non-intervention, so why it's managed? Because we need law enforcement, we need research, we need monitoring, visitor management, interpretation services, sometimes restoration. Like in the Kárpát National Park in Austria, if I remember correctly, they removed several tens of kilometers of former forest roads and restore them. So for these activities obviously require funding. And we also need to deal with invasive and potentially with high number of herbivores. That's a problem, for instance, in Hungary, because we don't really have large carnivores. The herbivores like red deer, roe deer, wild boar, they are in such a high number that it's really hard to actually bring up forest naturally, because they basically eat everything. What funding opportunities exist for land purchase? ERDF can help to compensate landowners, restoring the wilderness attributes. We can get Life Plus grants and with national co-financing that could be used for conservation projects. And for planning, we can actually mobilize Interreg funds. If I remember correctly, again, the World Heritage Site, the beach forest World Heritage Site, for instance, they were using Interreg fund to improve the cooperation among this multinational World Heritage Site. And maybe the RRF, the Resilience and Recovery Fund of the EU facility could have been used or could be used in the future, because actually 37% of the RRF fund should be used for climate and biodiversity purposes. It might be too late to actually change the RRF, but I wanted to list it here because, as we say in Hungarian, hope dies last. Maybe some of the funding in the RRF could be also used for protecting old-growth forest. Research opportunities also exist in order to improve the cooperation between the various countries. So the Horizon Europe is going to have very soon a call on conservation and protection of carbon-rich and biodiversity-rich forest ecosystem. That could be a really interesting project if we are able to collaborate across Europe to have additional scientific argument why the protection of old-growth forest is needed. And I mentioned here this newly developed research network, and I already mentioned the Griffith University project. We worked with the University of Life Sciences from Prague, Miroslav Svoboda and his research team. I wanted to present this as an example because it sounds kind of boring that, okay, we do a research, but through this research project, which was a multi-year, 4-year-long project, we arranged various presentations to leading EU policymakers. We influenced the biodiversity strategy. We developed actually a shadow forest strategy as well, or a scientific input for forest strategy. And a lot of the elements were echoed in the final forest strategy. We also had various publications. We contributed to the mapping of remaining old-growth forest published by the Joint Research Center. And more importantly, we established a wide network of committed researchers that we work together in the future as well on Horizon projects. What other opportunities on the EU level exist? That resonates again, the COP15. So payment for ecosystem service is an important element, or the certification for carbon removal, if it's not only used for artificial carbon removal technologies, but could be mobilized also for land sink. So it could be relevant for forest sector and not necessarily for forestry, but forest sector. And changing a little bit the accounting system, UN Strategic Environmental Economic Accounting is an existing system that could be used by countries, and it's already included in the COP15 as well. So actually, every country will have to adopt that system in its own budget. What are the implications for Czech Republic? And I hope that's one of the last slides. The European Investment Bank said that they are going to turn into a climate bank, which could provide potential funding for wilderness protection in every EU countries, including Czech Republic. The Czech Prioritized Action Framework could allocate EU funds, or can allocate EU funds for wilderness protection in the future. And you can also further investigate opportunities for payment for ecosystem services, for instance, paying for local landowners or private landowners for not cutting their trees, but protect the carbon that is locked into the forest. And the Czech NGOs, I think, should actively take part as stakeholders in the National Restoration Plan. And yeah, you will have to help in the identification of threatened old-growth forests. So if there is a threat to an area, then you have to flag that threat and provide a warning to the Commission. You have to get an OGF definition for your own country and have best practices on national policies and legislation, funding and general support. These are also needed for implementing the old-growth forest strategy in Czech Republic. So last slide, discussion items. So I'm really interested in hearing your questions or opinion, critics of this presentation, but what actions are needed. Research activities, I think, are needed. Restoration of ecosystem integrity and forest naturalness. We can talk about policy changes on a national level. You might need to do this in order to adopt recent policy changes on an EU level. Engagement with relevant stakeholders, and then the funding. These are the main discussion items. Thank you very much. This is my email. As I said, I'm open for questions and answers. And I try. Yeah, I think I stopped sharing my screen.
Well, many thanks, Zoltan, for your very interesting lecture. So now I'm opening the discussion. So I have two questions. My first question is, you have mentioned the goal 10% strict protection, and that the default should be actually the non-intervention management. So we had now last week we had another nice lecture with Michal Hošek, and his interpretation was that actually it's not necessary to speak only about the non-intervention regime, but this strict protected areas should be simply dedicated for nature conservation. And in case that these plots need some intervention for biodiversity, for example, that these plots could be also included in this 10% of strict protection. So what is your meaning about this?
Yeah, I'm not in 100% agreement with Michal. I know his opinion, and I know what he published. I think it was about 1.5 years ago, together with Handrij from Slovenia, who used to be chair of WCPA. I'm not really in an agreement with them, to be honest. But I mean, I see the point. They say that the strict protection, and if it's default, if the non-intervention is the default meaning of strict protection, that could lead to changes in certain habitat, maybe biodiversity loss in certain habitat, where, you know, like grasslands, for instance, or other habitat types than forest. Though, again, what I think it's really important in Europe, and my position that's why it's different from Michal. And if you remember, one of my slides included that we actually increase the strict protection would mean 15% strict protection in forest areas. I know that this would hit the roof for most of the foresters, but the reason why I say that, I think in some of the grasslands, the strict protection with non-intervention management cannot be implemented. There will be always mowing or grazing or other types of intervention. Still, the area is dedicated fully for conservation, but we still take something out as an ecosystem service, like meat or milk or hay or whatever. But these are still, I think, not necessarily strict protection, but more a combined protection of the area with sustainable use. Yeah, and I think strict protection means that it's really dedicated only for the protection of the site, without taking the provisional services out from the area, like timber or like milk or meat. So there is a bit of a disagreement between me and Michal, but and again, mathematically, I just made a bit of a calculation what this would mean for forest. That's why I said 15%, because if we discount those areas that are covered by artificial services, and we discount the extensively used agriculture areas from the land, that the 10% strict protection would mean that basically we have to protect 15% of the remaining land use, including forest as well. So again, there is a bit of a disagreement, but yeah, I'm more up for the default value, the non-intervention as a default value. And that would mean bigger representation of forest among the strictly protected areas than other types of habitats.
Yeah. Okay, and my second question is if you could explain the relation of Wild Europe to other European initiatives, such as European Wilderness Society. This is the former Pan Parks Network, or Rewilding Europe. We had a nice talk by Franz Scheppers some months ago. Then WWF is also focusing on wilderness. So some people might be quite confused with so many initiatives and organizations dealing with protection of wilderness. So if you can explain the differences, the overlaps, and so on.
Yeah, I would say that there is a big difference between the, let's say, bigger international organizations like, for instance, WWF or Greenpeace or IUCN, BirdLife. These are the large organizations that have obviously larger agendas. Wild Europe and I would say the European Wilderness Society a kind of specialized organization focusing on one element. Sometimes we work together with WWF in some countries, not in every country actually, but sometimes we work together with them if our interest overlaps. So in this case, let's take the example of the IUCN resolution that I mentioned in my presentation. That was actually sponsored, I'm in quotation mark, or let's say suggested by WWF France. And many organizations that co-sponsored the resolution were WWF offices. So, as I said, in some countries we work with these larger NGOs, but we are really specialized on wilderness. Why many organizations are needed? That's an interesting thing. If you take, for instance, Rewilding Europe, I think they are not really focusing on wilderness. They are focusing on rewilding. And I also talked to one of, what's the name? I can't remember the name of the one of their board members, Wouter Helmer, earlier, who actually said that for them, wilderness is not the ultimate goal. Yeah, for us, wilderness is an ultimate goal. For them, they are focusing more on the process and procedures. Yeah, while we are focusing on the end result. But we kind of cooperate. For instance, I'm a member of the Rewilding thematic working group, and I'm a member of the Rewilding thematic group of CM, and I'm a member of the cross-commission Rewilding working group as well. So, and I was one of the co-author of the publication on the guiding principles for rewilding. So actually we are kind of cooperating with them. Why we need them? Yeah, that's an interesting, I hope you will, every single person and every single organization has a little bit of a different viewpoint. And I think the diversity of organization adds actually to the discussion, and hopefully we will be able to work together to get for the common good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I might have been far too clear, far too fast, or whatever. You can, just maybe, if I can ask question, is there among the audience, maybe one person can say, if we would say, what do you think, how close we are in Czech Republic to at least the 10% tree protection target? Can someone comment on that? Is this feasible target in Czech Republic to have 10%? Yeah, because one thing, actually, that reminds me, the 10% tree protection target is an EU target. So it should be delivered on an EU level, which could mean that some countries have 11, 12, another country might have 6. So what the audience think about this tree protection target in Czech Republic? What's feasible? No one is. You can potentially unmute yourself.
Well, currently we have, let's say, maximum 2%. So I think to have 10% is quite a high number for the Czech Republic. But of course, it depends again on the interpretation of this tree protection. So generally, we can say, okay, we have 30% of forest area in the Czech Republic, so this should be not theoretically problem to have 10% forest dedicated for non-intervention. But I think the danger or the threat which we feeling in the Czech Republic by nature conservation is that there will be a huge pressure to convert existing protected area to this non-intervention regime, and in this case, this could be quite critical for some areas because of the biodiversity, of course.
Yeah, we have in Hungary that would be a similar problem, and I think our existing tree protection % coverage is actually even lower than yours. I would guess, at least in terms of forest cover in Hungary is roughly 2 million hectares, and what we can consider as, let's say, real nature forest is like 353 hectares. And what could be considered as really strictly protected. I think it's basically the so-called forest reserve network that covers roughly 15,000 hectares out of the 2 million. So actually for the forestry companies, for nature state-owned companies, this is going to be a big challenge. That's why I think one of the potential way to tackle that challenge is really to get some financial incentives, or maybe even, I mean, change a little bit how we calculate the values of forest, or how we calculate values of protected areas. That, I think that is really needed. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really difficult. I mean, I can understand. I mean, I know Shumaba, for instance, a little bit, Shumaba National Park. When I worked at PEM Parks, we were trying to cooperate with Shumaba. It was one of the first kind of pilot area. But I know one of the problems we had there was the, after the, what is it, the Ipstifographus bug beetle outbreak, heavy logging started in the area, and it was really difficult to work together with the park, because on contrary with the Bayerische National Park, they followed a completely different management regime. But yeah, I mean, I could get that from direct economic benefit, it was the easiest to deal with the forest management.
Yeah. Oh, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank again to Zoltan for a very nice lecture, and I wish to all of you a nice and hopefully mild winter. And I look forward to meeting you personally or virtually in the near future.
Again, thanks very much for inviting me, and yeah, good luck for everyone.